Okay, so I think this is fun, this next slide. Some interesting fit questions asked by top firms in the last few recruiting cycles. So I mentioned that 9 times out of 10, you would not get a question out of the ordinary. So you would not get a question that didn't fall on the slide that we just walked through. But there are some questions that pop up, and here are a few that I thought were pretty interesting. And again, these are real-world questions asked by MBB firms. Tell me about a time you had to improvise. Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to think about that one, how you had to improvise perhaps in solving a problem or working on a project. Next question is talking about getting buy-in from your team on your idea. It also came in another format, getting buy-in from someone senior to you. So I think this is a topical type question. I mean, when you think again about your role as a consultant, you're going to have ideas which you're effectively going to have to argue in order to move them forward. And you're, much like in a case interview, you're going to be collecting and analyzing data and coming up with some sort of solution or recommendation that you're going to have to convince the client to accept. So I thought that was a very interesting question. Tell me about a time when you missed a deadline. This one's actually tough. I mean, a lot of students, I don't think, can come up with a really good example of when they miss a deadline. But you need to think, how do you deal with conflict? Really, at the core, that's what this question is really focused in on. How do you deal with a conflict or a challenge? And give me an example of how you did that and how you overcame it. A difficulty getting information or data from a teammate or a client. This is another great one. I mean, this is the kind of question where I look at that and think, why didn't I think of this? Because in consulting, very often, it's not necessarily easy or straightforward to get the information or data out of the client that you want for various reasons. But if you were faced with that situation, what would you do? So a really interesting question I thought was asked. There were some real doozies. So I'm just going to share. This is McKinsey. So McKinsey is very unique in their fit interview process. They actually call it a personal experience interview, or a PEI. So what they do is they will ask you to walk through a specific project example. So it could be based on leadership or teamwork and whatnot, but they will spend 20 to 30 minutes talking about one specific example. And they'll ask you questions like, what was motivating the people on your team? What was motivating you? What were the names of your teammates? I mean, they're looking for a lot of the nitty-gritty specific detail. The good news is typically McKinsey will make you aware of what their fit interview process is like prior to the interview. They're going to email you out a preparation package, and they're going to assign you an interview buddy. So you will have some background information on this. But suffice to say, your preparation for every firm other than McKinsey is going to be a lot more straightforward than coming up with examples that you can talk to for 20 to 30 minutes. So very challenging. And lastly, I thought this was really interesting. So this was not a case. But the student, actually, I mean, every student that went through the interview with this particular consultant, they were in the interview, the consultant's phone rang. He picked it up, and he turned to the student, the candidate, and said, it's a message and it's for you. So the student took the phone, listened to the message, and then the consultant asked them a series of questions about that particular comments that the person on the other end on that message made. Really interesting, innovative. Doesn't surprise me in the least, because I know the firms are always looking for ways to innovate and to throw you a little bit of a challenge or a curveball. So I think this would be actually kind of fun if I were faced with a question or a scenario like that. But don't let it throw you off. I mean, it's really, they're just testing your ability to do the consulting job. Okay, so now we talked a little bit about the types of questions that you may face and the areas you want to be thinking about, like background, work experience, that sort of thing. In terms of tactically, how do you deliver a response? You should keep your responses to around 2 minutes in length and utilize a CAR or a CARL structure. So I want to talk a little bit about the length first, 2 minutes. That's not a lot of time. It may sound like a lot of time if you're relaxed and comfortable to be talking for 2 minutes, but under pressure, trust me, it's going to feel like 5 or 10 seconds went by, and 2 minutes will have gone by in actual fact. The reason why you want to be practicing coming up with responses that are about 2 minutes long is because you'll remember when I said the interview process goes through that welcoming icebreaker step, the fit interview step, the case interview step, and then candidate questions. They're going to want to ask you perhaps 2 or 3 or 4, I mean it really depends, behavioral questions during that short time frame before the case interview begins. And if you're giving a 4 or 5 minute response to one question, they're not going to be able to get to all the questions that they want to get to. So practice giving a short 2-minute concise response to the fit questions that you are practicing. Now, in terms of what does the response look like from a structure perspective, it's actually very similar to what a good impact statement on your resume would look like. So CAR stands for context, action, result. CARL is context, action, result, learned. Now, applying those specifically to a behavioral question, what does that mean? If the question was something like, tell me about a time when you were leading a team and you faced a challenge with one of your teammates, what did you do? You want to provide a little bit of context so that the consultant will understand what was going on. They'll have a little bit of detail or information. Then you want to talk specifically about what you did, so your actions. So we were faced with this challenge. What I did was A, B, C, and D. And then, of course, you want to close off with what was the result or the outcome of the actions that you engaged in as part of that example. And I would say that if you took a look at the context, action, results on a plane or on a continuum, 80% of your response should be focused in on your actions. So you don't want to over-contextualize your response. And this is a common mistake that a lot of candidates make. They'll talk long about the situation, the people, all that sort of thing. Now, McKinsey aside, because McKinsey, of course, would perhaps expect you to and encourage you to do that, you want to keep the context short and concise and spend a majority of your time talking about what you did specifically, because it makes sense. That's the only way you're going to be able to effectively communicate what your transferable skills are if you're talking about the types of things that you were doing. And, result is important. What impact did you have on that example? Hopefully it was a positive outcome, although that's not always the case. So context, action, result, it's a good framework to leverage when you're preparing for and responding to behavioral questions. But I also wanted to introduce the concept of CARL or learned. So the questions you get in an interview now, if you look at the graphic, tell me about a time when you led a team. There's going to be a positive or a neutral scenario that's presented to you. So on a successful project, or what's your greatest accomplishment? I mean, those are positive, or you could call them neutral scenarios. You may get faced with a negative scenario. So a challenge, a problem, missed a deadline, a failure. So listen for that cue. If you get any kind of negative scenario type question, you need to add what you learned at the end of the context, action, result. So effectively what's going to happen is, here's what was going on, here's what I did specifically, which is the actions, here was the result or the outcome, and most importantly, what I learned was A, B, C. Okay? So CAR and CARL, you want to use that depending on the type of question you get, positive, neutral, or negative scenario, and keep your responses to about 2 minutes in length.